Let's go full volume on that. Here we go. Nope. Let's go back. That's my pens. Okay, good evening. Once again, Ronald Allen, Managing Change Through Effective Communications. And as we've experienced in the past, we had an interruption, and that's okay, because that is technology. As we always say, technology has the last laugh. We're talking about communicating with marginalized people. And we discussed in part A, as they say, that was a forced part A. Good evening, Anne. Thank you very much for sending me those messages. I did have to cut off and start again. As we do, that's what we do in managing change in effective communications, is to create an A and B side, and you'll see the A shortly up on Facebook. And then we will continue talking about our marginalized people. And I mentioned in the first part that in many cases, you'll find that family members, people close to you, will represent some of the biggest challenges. And when we go out in public, that is then extended if we don't arrest or consciously decide how we want those interactions to go. They get compounded, of course, when you have groups of people who express the same uncomfortable feeling, the uneducated, I'll use that term, the uneducated because they're allowing their emotions and or a group conversation, a group direction in thinking, to persuade them and therefore act in a way that perhaps is really not in their best interest, right? So instead of, say, just being quiet and observing, instead of, say, looking for the benefit of what that other person might bring to the table, and certainly being grateful for not having to have those mental, physical, or emotional limitations. I mean, those three things alone should put you in check. Although, as we've seen in public and certainly on social media, many people get kind of ugly, right? They charge in with their emotions. They demand to be seen, heard, noticed, their voice, their opinion, as much as it's like an empty kettle drum without the corn, can interrupt, and that's what they want. So we must arrest our own emotions. So when we talk about, as I mentioned, communicating with marginalized people, we are talking about all levels, all aspects of a failure of communication. And that can come about because of how we see that other person. I was starting to mention education, and I think that's really the first area. And when I talk about education, it is certainly the formal environment. Moreover, it's what we decide to learn. You know, there are three stages. We've all primarily come out of a pedagogy style of education. Well, that is where the institutions, the social educational institutions tell us what is significant. And that has been pretty much since education was developed in the monasteries of Europe. And that comes out of a pedagogy style. We will tell you what to learn, we'll tell you what's significant, we'll tell you what cultures, what aspects of culture, such as I learned about Picasso, and then finding out that because of his influence in the Second World War being impacted in North Africa, a lot of his cubism and hard-shaped, seemingly erratic painting, you can see the pain, you can see the juxtaposition between an image and what is being expressed at that time, comes out of North Africa, and the color that was imbued in his work. Just as we see Van Gogh cutting off his ear because he was frustrated with his own inability to get his message across. When we look at those things, we are told that this is fine art. Yet the culture that it comes from may be marginalized. When we look at, certainly in the northeast of the United States, a lot of the names in Pennsylvania and parts of certainly New Jersey, Connecticut, down to Virginia and further south, are of the indigenous tribes that originated and inhabited this earth, this part of the earth. Yet they themselves have been removed. So our social inclination, our belief in who these people are, is swayed one way, primarily one way, until we actively want to and seek out their own conversation, their own voices. And that's really the only way to arrest the kind of ugliness, bigotry, hate that we find across the world. You know, we can talk about Armenia and Egypt. We can talk about Northern Ireland and England. We can talk about many of the Latin American countries that we look at today. Whether it's Dutch, whether it's not just Brazil, I'm thinking of Portugal, Belgium, they all influenced other countries. And the conversation that you're hearing today stems from that. It's not abstract, it's not arbitrary, it's not distant. The conversation is continued. So what I'm suggesting, what I'm looking to bring to the front is understand where these conversations come from. And then you decide, is that something that's really what I want to continue? Is that a belief system? Is that a cultural nuance? Is that beneficial to my future education and those of my children? Because let's face it, the legacy we're leaving is what our children will continue and support. When we think of access to information, at what cost? Look at social media. We all say, well, the internet is free. To get to the internet is not. Yes, you've heard me in previous conversations talk about libraries. Not always accessible, and for the time that we need them, not always available. In my own town, we have a great library and multiple laptops and PCs, desktops, I should say. And then at the main library at the county is even more accessible. I have a car. I'm able to move around. I can accommodate their hours. So again, when we talk about communicating with marginalized people, it is also the society's meaning, the society's definition that's put upon us that we may not fully understand. Legal injustice, you know, the term institutional and systemic prejudices. Again, if you look at your own culture, go back in time, do yourself a favor, go back in time, and you'll see that at one time, your own nationality, those people that you stem from, whether it's multiracial, Jewish, Egyptian, English, Dutch, French, it doesn't really matter. In fact, in the first half of this conversation, I mentioned the term prima noce. That's when forced copulation was enforced in Europe, so that you would breed out the hostility, breed out the difference in people. So when we understand that, and we come into a conversation, we can be a little bit more intelligent in the way we position an argument. We can be less reactive and more responsive. We can say, that's an interesting position. Where did you get that from? Where's that coming from? And listen more. And engage the conversation and bring out from the other person, say, that's interesting. I heard, what do you think of that? See what happens. See how the difference in the conversation, the tone of the conversation. We have a bunch of Wawas in our Northeast region. These are convenience stores. They have pretty much everything. Hot food, soft drinks, some fairly healthy drinks, coffee, of course, and a smorgasbord of products from milks, ice cream, candies, health foods, etc. Donuts, of course. And every morning, if you go out there 5, 6, 7, between those hours, you'll see different work groups. Migrant workers? Absolutely. We have a lot of fields where I am. A lot of corn, alfalfa, lettuce, a lot of fields. And immigrant workers come and they stay and they wait for work. Then you'll see some contractors coming in, landscapers, construction. And then you'll see another group, which are more union workers, and they go off to both county, city, and then private corporate accounts. And if you listen to the conversation, it's incredibly similar. It is incredibly similar, and it's about how frustrating life and their jobs are. And I take it upon myself to say, what would I do? So now I rephrase it and I say, what am I doing to address my needs? From the conversation from 3 or 4 totally different people, totally different groups of people, yet the underlying common denominator is, I need to improve my life. That's the conversation. So when you think again of the so-called marginalized person, be very careful. I guarantee you, your own ancestry, your own group of people, your nationality, your culture, your ancestry, I guarantee you, they were at one time the low end of the rung. And in many cases, still today, populations of your own culture are still at the low end of the rung. So what do you do? What does that mean for you? It means be more compassionate. It means be more human. It means have some humility. It means don't bark at everything. Right? Shut up. In England, we have an expression. You give an aspirin a headache, you know? Don't always bark at everything. Have some understanding of how things have come about and, unfortunately, how things have stayed the same. Sure, it's maybe a different group. I was talking to a gentleman today who's working with the state of New Jersey, and he's looking to help small business enterprises grow. And I explained to him, I shared this with him, I said that, you know, in southern New Jersey, a place called Vineland, New Jersey, very remote, very country. In fact, it was at one time known for its agricultural production. There are 3 generations of Mexican citizens, now U.S. citizens, who are business owners. And yet, if you listen to mainstream noise, I call it noise, not news, you would think that that's not the case. There are some great movies out here there's one that's called A Day Without a Mexican. Some of you may have seen it and watched it. Absolutely brilliant. And it's not just the labor force. It's education, it's sports, it's administration, it's management, it's supervision throughout all industries. Let me share with you, I said in the first half, you know, this is part B. Thank you very much, FB. I said I was going to share some books with you. This is an old book. I'm not sure if you can see this. I'm not sure if it's even making sense. Maybe the picture is. But it talks about the subjection of women. John Stuart Mill, The Subjection of Women. I read this many years ago. It's an older book. Yet the irony is, the conversation, managing change through effective communication, the subjection of women, is that women still today are expressing the same concerns. Certainly, there are many more as top executives. The percentage is pathetic. Yes, there have been many women who have been presidents of many countries, including Pakistan, a Muslim country, that seems to hold women back. So why is it that this book that was written in bada bing, bada boom, when was this book written? And it was actually Cambridge, Massachusetts, and London, England, the MIT Press. So that's kind of cool. 1972, 1970. Original edition, 1869. Reprinted as recently as 1978. Why is it that, almost 100 years, this issue is still being addressed so broadly? Why is it not a minor issue? It's marginalized. It's communicating with marginalized people. Our mothers and grandmothers, our daughters, our nieces, they are still being subjected to that. So there is an inconsistency with messaging and marketing and the reality of life. Another book that I really love, and I even tried to reach out to this gentleman, this is Weapons of Mass Instruction by John Taylor Gatto. And in case any of you think that I'm kind of wailing on society, this is an educator from New York, 20, 30 years. Incredible guy. Sonny, thank you for checking in. Wendy, thank you for checking in. An incredible teacher who, when he was awarded a prestigious educational recognition, he said that we're dumbing down our children. That was almost 15, 20 years ago, by the way. Again, in fact, he has another book called Dumbing Us Down. You see, the problem is, what part of the problem? I'm not professing that there's all one. We really don't know how a lot of our technology works. We enter it from the front end, we don't know about the back end. And what's worse yet, we also don't understand the implications of much of the social media. So our conversation is surface deep. That's the deal, our conversation. And we can correct that at any time if we want to engage with meaning. So when we talk about communicating with marginalized people, it's not just those who are mentally and physically challenged. It's with your mother and father, your brother and your sister, your nephews and nieces, your friends, your social groups, and asking to be more accountable, be more on purpose. We're not talking about a template of how to be effective, how to be motivational. We're talking about when you wake up in the morning, is it with intent? Do you want to address the challenges in your life in a meaningful way? In fact, the expression in our home is, will you go down on your own sword? Don't be rude, you guys out there. I'm being professional. Will you die on your own sword? These are old phrases that last the test of time. Are you going to give in because it becomes difficult, because your nucleus of friendship rant and rave on you for being educational, to be wanting to learn? Do you dumb yourself down? That's what these books are all about. There's another great book, which, again, it's been around a long time, Ethnocentrism. Well, here's one for you when we talk about communicating with marginalized people. We use today the expression that everybody else other than so-called a Caucasian person is of an ethnic background. Well, the last time I looked at European history, Roman conquering, Dutch conquering, 1066 in England, they weren't interested in your ethnicity. They wanted you and your land and your raw material for what they could build. Yet we've forgotten that. So we've bought into a conversation that marginalizes all of us, and yet we think, because we dress, because we are associated with certain companies, we are associated with certain clubs, we carry certain plastic, we do certain things, we behave in a certain way, that we're accepted. Yet when it comes time for corporate anything to maneuver its assets, we find ourselves quickly marginalized. So when we think of this ethnocentrism, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, again, look back in time, because the same behavior, the same marketing, the same meaning has simply been recontextualized. It's been reformatted. There was a great song, I can't remember the artist, but it was called Living in the Life of the Common People. And I know Americans don't like to hear that. The reality is, we are all being maneuvered. And in talking about effective communications, are you listening carefully enough to say, do we really need to engage with that, with our family as a microcosm of the macro economy? And if we begin to address that, then many of our so-called mental and social problems will not be absorbed. I just don't engage in that. And when our children behave out and start to say, well, our friends have this and our friends have that, then you engage them. You don't tell them, well, go to your friends. You don't push them away. You say, well, come on, let's see how that works. You see, that's the difference. We can be hostile. Oh, easy to be hostile. What about having some mental fortitude and say, what can we learn from this? What can we do to see if that behavior is sustainable? That physical item is really what we need to spend our money on. See, we can always bring it back to that material world, no problem. Engage the youth who feel that it's easy and they have these temper tantrums, and we call it ADHD, and engage them in the process of evaluating whether it's good or bad, beneficial or not. Another great book that I always share, it's called The Fundamentals of Interpersonal Communication. My mother gave me this book